A 7-foot creature is floating outside their car. It has pincers for hands, and it's inspecting their car like it wants to buy it. It's September 13th, 1952, rural West Virginia, 20 miles south of Flatwoods, near a spot called Strange Creek. Edith and George Snitowski are driving Route 4 back to New York after visiting friends in Ohio. Their 18-month-old son is asleep in the back seat. Then the engine dies, and with it goes the headlights and the radio. Now they're stuck in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. That's when they smell it. Rotten eggs and skunk. Edith and George glance at each other with accusing looks. George does the 1950s dad thing and gets out of the car to check under the hood. And by the way, it smells worse outside the car than it did inside. Before he can lift the hood, though, Edith is tapping on the window and pointing frantically. So George turns around, and just off the road in the shadows, there's a figure, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, floating about a foot off the ground. George dives back into the car, and he locks the doors. Then he shoves Edith and the baby onto the floor, and he covers them both with his body. And he frantically grabs for his only weapon, a small pocket knife he kept in the glove box. The thing from the shadows floats over and starts inspecting the car. Slow, methodical. George catches a glimpse of its hand, except it's not a hand. It's just 2 long pincers. He looks up and he sees a reptilian face staring back at him. He looks down, and instead of seeing legs, he sees metal. Imagine a guy standing in a floating metal trash can. And after a few laps around the car, this mega-sized Oscar the Grouch floats down the road, and it's gone. Weird, right? But this wasn't the only sighting. Not even close. 2 days earlier, a group had their own pungent encounter, and not everyone walked away unscathed. This is the story of the Flatwoods Monster.
Rick Burke is a pastor. His brother Rob isn't. Together, they go looking for the stories nobody's telling on Sunday morning. Strange history, unexplained encounters, and the corners of the world where things get weird. Welcome to the Parsonage Files.
This is the Parsonage Files. I'm Rick.
This is Rob.
So before we get to the Snitowskis, you need to know what happened the night before. 20 miles north in a little town called Flatwoods. September 12th, 1952. Okay, it's a Friday night. You've got a group of boys playing football behind Flatwoods Elementary. Kind of small town evening where the biggest thing on your mind is whether your mom's going to make you come in before the game's over. Then the sky lights up. It's just like a bad movie. It's very much like a 1950s science fiction movie.
It really is, yeah.
So one of the boys looks up and he sees a bright object streaking across the sky. Looks like it came down somewhere near the Fisher farm just up the hill. And if you're a kid in 1952, you have never seen anything like that. So those boys, they take off running. And they run to the house of a woman named Kathleen May. Kathleen's 32 years old. She's a beautician, born and raised right there in Flatwoods. 2 of those boys at her door are her sons, 12 and 13 years old. The rest are their friends. And they come busting through her door, telling her something just fell out of the sky. Kathleen May doesn't tell them to settle down. Doesn't tell them they're imagining things. She listens to their story, and then she decides to go with them to investigate this light they saw.
Well, that's a really good 1950 mom thing to do. She's clearly never seen a horror movie.
On their way up the hill, they run into a young man named Gene Lemon, Kathleen's cousin. He was 17 years old, and he was already a member of the West Virginia National Guard. So Gene hears from the group about this light coming down on the hill, and he decides to join in this journey. So he grabs the flashlight and comes along. The family dog, a little guy named Ricky, also joins this group.
They thought a plane crashed, right?
Yeah, they apparently thought that a plane had crashed. Kathleen and Jean went up the hill to see if anybody needed help. So now you've got this little group headed up a dark hillside. You've got Kathleen, her boys, the rest of the kids that they were playing football with, Jean with his flashlight, and out front, Ricky the dog. Then this group encounters a mist that wasn't there before, and their eyes start burning. There's some kind of smell in the air, metallic, almost sulfur-like. Some of them are coughing. Up ahead through the trees, there's this red glow that keeps brightening and dimming. Ricky gets out ahead of the group and runs toward the glow, and a few seconds later comes running back past them, going the other way with his tail tucked.
That is a hard no from the dog.
Yes, the dog had the sense to leave, but the people, they kept going. Gene's out front because he's got the flashlight. Kathleen's right behind him. The boys are clumped up behind her. And they're getting close to whatever this glow is. And the smell is getting stronger, and the mist is getting thicker. Gene raises his flashlight up to look around, and the beam catches something next to a tree. He's expecting maybe a piece of metal, wreckage of some kind, maybe a downed plane. But that's not what he sees.
What does he see, Pastor Rick?
Well, it's taller than anything that should be standing out in those woods. There's a face, red, almost like it's lit from the inside. The eyes, they're glowing, not reflecting the flashlight back, but actually glowing on their own. The height is somewhere between 7 and 10 feet. The body's dark, covered in sort of like a drapery type of outfit. And there is this Ace of Spades hood that is behind that red face. Some witnesses said it didn't look like it had legs, like the bottom half just kind of trailed off into the dark, and it made a sound, hissing.
Oh, no, heck no, I'm out of there.
Then this thing moved toward them. Gene Lemon dropped the flashlight. Kathleen grabbed the boys. That's when the Fellowship of the Stink retreated down the hill. Nobody could see anything. Gene's flashlight was on the ground back where the thing was. They were running downhill in the dark, through trees, through that stink. Kids tripping, Kathleen pulling them back up, the smell still in their lungs. And they didn't stop until they hit Kathleen's front porch. By the time they made it back to Kathleen's house, some of them were actually quite sick. A few were throwing up, most had swollen eyes and burning throats, and whatever they had breathed in up on that hill was still in them. Gene Lemon, he got it worse. He'd been up front with the flashlight, so he caught the most of whatever it was in the air. And he even ended up having a kind of a convulsion later that evening. Gene was sick for several days after, and Ricky the dog, he died 2 days later from respiratory damage. Now, nobody thought to keep his body, because in 1952, you just did an autopsy of family dog.
Thanks for bringing me down with this story, Pastor Rick.
So Kathleen called the sheriff, and they tried to organize a group to go back up the hill and look around. But by the time they made it up there with proper lights, whatever it was gone. But there was still that smell in the air. And by the next morning, people who went back to the site reported skid marks on the ground, a gummy residue on the grass, and the whole area smelled, well, just wrong.
I think that would be more fuel on the fire for this story.
Yeah, absolutely, because by the next day, people from all over Braxton County were driving into Flatwoods to see the hill for themselves. In a small Appalachian town where everybody knew everybody, news traveled fast. A reporter from the Braxton Democrat was out there fast. He interviewed the witnesses, went up to the site, wrote it up, and his story spread. First to the wire services, then to the papers in other states, then to radio shows. And within a couple of days, this thing was national news. Kathleen May and the reporter flew to New York and went on a CBS show called We the People. A New York TV artist drew the sketch of the creature based on what Kathleen and the reporter described, live in front of a studio audience. And that sketch is the one most people still picture when they hear Flatwoods Monster, the spade-shaped hood, the red face, the glowing eyes. By September of 1952, a lot of Americans were already nervous when they looked up. People were primed for something like Flatwoods, and the story, it just took off. The Air Force eventually did weigh in on the case, and their official position was that the witnesses had simply seen a meteor and had probably misidentified an owl sitting in a tree. An owl. We're going to get to that owl, but first, I got to tell you about the guy who actually got out a notebook and tried to figure out what happened. This man's name was Ivan T. Sanderson. He was a zoologist. He'd already hunted big animals in Africa and Central America for zoos. He wrote for a living, specifically wrote about strange creatures and unexplained reports. Not somebody who got fooled easily. A New York magazine called True sent him down to Flatwoods to investigate. He drove there with a friend. When he got there, he linked up with two chemists from a Monsanto plant in South Charleston and the editor of the local paper. So Sanderson didn't bumble around in the woods alone. He had this field team, if you will. And one of the chemists was a pretty decent photographer.
So this really wasn't just one guy in the woods with a notepad.
Oh, no, not even close. And they interviewed every witness, individually and as a group. They walked the site. They took photos. They grabbed samples. Sanderson sat down with those witnesses one at a time and listened to them carefully. He asked them to describe what they saw. He took down their answers. And what they told him did not match the famous drawing at all. The one everybody pictures with the spade-shaped hood and the red face, that came out of the live TV session on We the People. Sanderson's interviews were quieter. One person at a time, no audience, no artist. And what the witnesses described to him was this: some kind of bulb where you would expect a head. Two openings in the bulb, light coming out of them, a halo or a hood shape above that. A body more like a column than a person. And the way it moved wasn't biological, it floated smoothly, almost silently. Now, Sanderson was a zoologist, and he said that this didn't look like an animal to him. He thought it looked like a robot, maybe a shell or a suit with something inside it.
So basically an alien in a half shell.
Perhaps. Now, the famous picture of this creature has a face, two eyes, pointed hood, looks almost like a Halloween costume. But the creature the witnesses described didn't have a face or arms or legs that anyone could clearly see. So the famous spade-faced creature in the souvenir shops, that's not what the witnesses described at all. What they described was something with a bulb where a head should be, light coming out of holes, a column for a body, and a way of moving that, well, wasn't biological.
All right, slow down, Pastor Rick. I'm starting to get confused here. So,
Yeah, okay. So let's slow down. You've got multiple witnesses. You've got the kids, a mom, a National Guardsman, and they all agreed on a tall figure that put out light. Now, the details varied, but the basic shape is the same, according to all of these witnesses. And the sickness that these witnesses experienced was also very, very real. Throats were really burning. Eyes were really swollen. Jean Lemon really did have a convulsion. People at Kathleen's house saw kids who were physically sick. And we can't forget that Ricky the dog died 2 days later from respiratory damage. So if we check the historical record, what we'll find is that a meteor really did cross the sky that night. People saw it across 3 or 4 different states. So the boys out playing football really did see a light streak across overhead. That part is undisputed. But no meteor fragment was ever found anywhere near Flatwoods. And whatever the boys saw up that hill probably never came down from that meteor at all. Yeah, so the boys ran up that hill thinking they were going to find a meteor.
And wasn't no meteor they found.
No, not at all.
Did anyone see anything else?
Indeed, they did. There's a young woman named Audra Harper, and she lived about 5 miles north of Flatwoods in a little place called Heaters. And a few days before Kathleen May and her group climbed that hill in Flatwoods, Audra and a friend, whose name didn't survive in the records, were walking through the woods to a store. And on their way, they saw what looked like a fire on a hillside. Audra figured it was just a neighbor. Then she looked closer, and the fire was gone. In its place stood a tall, dark figure, 9-10 feet tall, man-shaped, but somehow wrong. And the two girls took off running, and the figure followed them. And they didn't stop until they hit the gate at Audra's house.
So this incident took place over multiple days.
Well, apparently. So this wasn't just one night before. This was a couple of days before.
Right.
Which means whatever was going on out there, it had already started before the boys ever saw the meteor overhead. And on the night of the Flatwoods sighting itself, September 12th, there was another witness, a farmer on a different hillside. He just noticed a glow, went and got his binoculars. And Sanderson recorded this man during his field work. Unfortunately, he didn't name him in any published accounts, but apparently his testimony was very detailed and consistent with what Sanderson had been told by the others. What the farmer saw through his binoculars was a pear-shaped object, black, pulsating red and orange, sitting on the ground on its blunt end, narrow end up. It didn't take off, it just kept pulsing and getting smaller and smaller until it wasn't there anymore.
Like it phased out?
Yeah. And a whole different witness, right? A whole different hillside. And Sanderson's team found a circle on the hillside where Kathleen and the boys had been, about 15 feet across, grass and leaves all pushed down in a rough ring. And inside the ring, 3 pod marks stood in a triangle, like something had sat down on 3 legs and held its weight there long enough to leave an impression. And they photographed it, they examined it, and they wrote it up in a paper. So the chemists took some samples back to the Monsanto lab, and most of what they tested came back, well, how tests on UFO
Always come back?
evidence always comes back inconclusive. A few pieces of white debris from a nearby site turned out to be something biological, but probably unrelated. But the circle and the 3 pod marks were still there. The skid marks people had reported on the first morning, by the time Sanderson got there a couple of days later, those were gone. And the gummy residue, well, it was gone too. And the site had been walked over by, well, almost half the county.
Half the county, right? Yeah. So, of course.
But then there's the Snitowskis. Couple in the car, baby in the back, the night after the Flatwoods incident. And there's a part of their story that I haven't told you yet. After the thing reached across the windshield, the family stayed down. George had his arm around Edith. Edith and the baby were both crying. George had the knife, and they could hear the thing just outside the car. Then they heard it stop. And when George finally looked up, the creature was gliding away from them, back towards something, a violet, glowing globe, hovering just above the ground, pulsing with light. The creature glided into it. The globe rose up into the sky and disappeared over the trees. George waited a long time before he started the car, and it started right up. They drove to a motel in Sutton. Next morning, a gas station attendant pointed at their hood, and there was this V-shaped burn mark on it, right where the creature had been standing.
Oh, come on.
Well, maybe. So We have 3 nights, 3 totally different groups of witnesses, and none of them seem to be working with the others.
All right. So let's back this up and put our skeptic caps on.
All right.
So the first explanation for what occurred that night was that the boys saw a real-life meteor go over.
Correct.
They go up a dark, spooky hill.
Correct.
Get scared, see a giant owl come running back down the hill, and are freaked out and claim that it was an alien.
Well,
Or a monster.
now, hear me out on this, because the owl theory is, I think, better than most people give it credit for. I mean, a barn owl is bigger than you'd think. Wingspan can be well over 3 feet. White, heart-shaped face. The eyes catch any light and reflect it back to you. And hit one of those with a flashlight beam in the dark, and those eyes, they just light up, right? And owls, they perch on trees. So if you're climbing up a hill and the owl's up on a branch, you're looking at it, makes it taller than it actually is. And the wings, they spread out. And the kids were scared half to death already. The meteor they had just seen fills their brains with space and
And they're kids.
yeah. And, I've been spooked myself walking through a parking lot at night because I thought a shopping cart was a person. Our brains do this stuff.
Unfortunately, that is the case. I thought I was being abducted by an alien one time in an apartment I lived in.
And you weren't?
No, it was a fan with a hoodie hanging on top of it, and it looked like a great alien standing there in a hooded. Okay, moving on.
We're moving on. And the skid marks people reported that first morning, investigators later traced those back to a local guy named Max Lockard.
Is there any truth to the legend that he was the local chili champion?
Unverified. He'd driven his pickup truck through the site to take a look. The skid marks were his tire tracks, and the gummy residue was the oil leaking from his old truck. So the most photogenic piece of physical evidence from that morning turns out to be a Chevy.
Of course, because a Ford wouldn't be leaking like that.
So the owl theory, it isn't crazy, and the tire tracks turns out really aren't very good evidence. And it gives the skeptics something to hang on to. The trouble is, the owl theory has to explain absolutely everything. The smell, the sickness, a dead dog, a creature 7 feet tall on the ground, not in a tree, an owl. Well, it doesn't explain any of that. What an owl really can't explain is what Sanderson's team found in the grass. A 15-foot circle of pressed grass with 3 impressions set in a triangle, photographed by a zoologist and 2 Monsanto chemists who knew what they were looking at. No bird makes that pattern. And then there's the Air Force itself. Officially, they say it was a meteor, case closed. But behind the scenes, a completely different story. So the head of the Air Force's UFO program, a guy named Captain Edward Ruppelt, who ran Project Blue Book until it was shut down in 1969, had a 3x5 card in his files listing the few UFO cases that involved an entity. Next to West Virginia, he typed, "Monster was walking, so let the Army have it."
That is the most legit government thing I have ever read.
Yep, not our deal anymore. It's walking. The Army can deal with it.
Give that monster to somebody else.
In early October of 1952, an Air Force intelligence officer named Major Dewey Fournette sent a memo to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. He wanted soil samples from Flatwoods analyzed right away. And he paired the request with another case from Florida that had a strange soil signature. And he marked the whole thing utmost priority.
Which would seem to suggest he didn't think it was just an owl.
And now there's one more name, Captain Dale Levitt, West Virginia National Guard. He went to the site officially in uniform as part of the response to what those folks reported. And a photograph of him on the hillside ran in the press soon after. A named on-record National Guard officer confirming physical trace evidence, while the Air Force was publicly saying that it was just an owl.
So someone probably should get on the same page, right?
Now, this isn't what you would expect if the case simply involved an owl.
Yeah, the world's most powerful military concerned about an owl. Yeah.
So, could some of what had been seen an owl? Maybe. Could be that some of the kids saw an owl in the tree and their brains made it bigger because they were already scared. The owl by itself, though, doesn't get you all the way home. There's the swamp gas idea. Natural gas pockets in those hills can leak in ways that smell just awful and burn your eyes, cause married couples to blame one another for flagellants. And there's some real science there, though swamp gas with glowing eyes is kind of a stretch. Then there's the theory that I find interesting. Researchers, looking back at this case, pointed out that the symptoms, burning throats, swollen eyes, vomiting, dizziness, sulfur smell, a dead dog, line up with chemical exposure way better than that of an owl.
What kind of chemical do you think it was?
Well, nobody's really certain, but this is 1952. The military was testing all kinds of things in remote areas, classified work that civilians wouldn't have known about. Some folks have suggested that whatever those kids walked into on that hillside might have been the release of something military, and the figure they saw might have just been a person in protective gear or just their imagination filling in the blanks because they were, well, scared and sick. But there's no hard evidence for this at all. But it would explain the dog dying. It would explain the soil sample request. It would explain why a Pentagon that had publicly been saying it was an owl was privately making documents utmost priority. And then there's what the witnesses themselves believed. They saw something, well, not from around here.
Aliens?
Well, that's what Kathleen May believed until the day she died. And that's what Gene Lemon believed as well.
And that's kind of sensational, right?
Well, I'm not bringing it up to be sensational. I'm bringing it up because I think we should at least be honest about what the witnesses themselves said. They said it was something they couldn't explain. And they stuck to that story for the rest of their lives, even though people made fun of them. But whatever it was, those folks went up that hill as regular West Virginia people, and they came back down changed. And no explanation we've come up with in 70 years has fully accounted for that change.
All right, I have a question for you. Why does everybody picture that spade-faced creature when they hear about this case instead of the bulb-headed one?
Well, there's really two reasons. The drawing on national TV and a guy named Gray Barker.
That name sounds familiar, dude.
It should. Barker was from Clarksburg, West Virginia, already interested in flying saucers when Flatwoods happened. And he drove to the site just a few days after the incident, and he interviewed Kathleen May and Gene Lemon. And he wrote it up for a magazine called Fate Magazine.
I've heard of it.
Then in 1956, Gray Barker wrote a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And that book kept the Flatwoods story alive, at least in the UFO world. It also gave the world some other very important UFO lore, in particular, Men in Black.
Those are the guys that turn up when you see UFOs, slap you in the face, and tell you to keep the UFOs out of your mouth.
Those are the ones, and they are Barker's idea from a story about a UFO researcher named Albert Bender, who Barker claimed was visited by 3 government agents in dark suits.
Wait, what?
Yeah, the whole thing. Every Men in Black movie, every dark-suited government agent in UFO lore can all trace its way back to a guy from Clarksburg, West Virginia.
How come most people have never heard of this dude?
Well, because Barker was never taken seriously as a UFO researcher, because Barker was also known as a bit of a prankster and, well, let's be honest, a hoaxer. He faked letters, he fabricated stories. He treated the UFO field like part journalism and part show business, which is why the spade-faced creature beat the bulb-headed one in the public imagination. Barker was just simply a louder and better storyteller than Sanderson. He wrote more books, he went on the radio more, and he made the legend bigger. Sanderson did actual field work. Barker, though, he built the myth.
And the myth won.
But the people who climbed that hill weren't myth, they were real. And so was whatever it is that they ran into.
Chili champion George?
Something. And that burned their eyes, made them sick, and killed a pretty healthy dog inside of 2 days. Gene Lemon raised his flashlight and he saw something he couldn't explain. The witnesses themselves described something stranger than the famous drawing, something that really seems more like a machine than an animal. And there was, of course, a 15-foot ring of pressed grass and 3 impressions in it. A farmer on a different hill even watched a pear-shaped object pulse and shrink to nothing.
And I think that's the part most people miss when they kind of tell this story. Everybody wants it to either be aliens or an owl. And you're saying there's something in between that.
Well, yeah, for me, I am perfectly happy not knowing if this group actually saw an alien or an owl, whatever it was. For me, the story is awesome because it's a good story.
Right.
And I like mysteries, and I think the world, quite frankly, needs more mystery in it. So I'm perfectly happy just leaving it right where it's at.
Everybody loves a good story.
So I'm Rick,
I'm Rob.
and this has been the Parsonage Files. And Rob, real quick, do you know what lesson I took from this story?
What would that be, Pastor Rick?
Next time you smell an unfortunate egg-based smell, don't be so quick to blame your significant other.
Or your dog.
It's one to grow on. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Parsonage Files. Join us again as we explore strange stories from the worlds of faith, history, and legend.